I have enjoyed making different quilts for each of my children, and when pregnancy comes around, a new blanket idea comes to mind. For my daughter, I made this letter quilt and hand-stitched quilt. For my second, that is now in heaven, I made this star quilt, which was so life-giving to make during a difficult season. And for our boy on the way, it felt fitting to include my daughter and make a quilt from her art and some family doodles. I hope this inspires you to get your little ones involved in the process. This quilt is not perfect by any means. It's whimsical, quirky, and I love it. I want to preface this by saying, I am not a quilter. I've made quilts for my family and love how relaxed this one is. I'll be showing you the process to make your own, but I've added some helpful quilting videos below in case you want to learn more about the quilting process. My goal with this video is to inspire you with the idea to sew a quilt from your children's art, get them involved, and have something relaxing to do with your hands. Plus, I really think this is a great project for a beginner. So here is how to make a quilt from your children's art. I used plain quilting muslin for my daughter to draw on. To create a crib size quilt or smaller, you want 1 yard for the art piece side and 1 yard for the fabric of your choice for the back. I found these fabric markers that I've linked below. They are easy to use and withstood washing. For the batting, I used this natural cotton that I double layered. To begin, I laid out a wipeable mat on our floor and laid out the white muslin on top for my daughter to draw on. We did this for a few days, taking it outside in the nice weather to draw on and coming back to it when we felt like it. We even had friends and family join in too. I love that it was a group art project. I chose not to rush the process and just allowed my daughter to draw as she wanted. This was early in my first trimester, and then I finished the quilt weeks before the due date. After the white fabric was covered, I washed it on a gentle cycle and put it away until I was ready to sew it into a quilt. Here is a tip. If you want to keep this a whole cloth quilt and make it a really simple sewing project, you can skip this next part about cutting it into squares. I personally chose to cut the art into squares to keep with the quilted look and make it more abstract. This is totally up to you and personal preference. Next, I cut each piece into 8.5 by 8.5 squares, and I cut 20 squares for this smaller size quilt. Now lay out each square as you want them sewn together, and I went for a very random design. Right sides facing, sew each square together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. For the next row, iron the seams to the opposite side. Now match the rows together and sew until all the squares are sewn to create a quilt top. Lay the quilt top wrong side up on a flat surface. Take your batting and layer it on top. Once it is smoothed out, layer the back fabric of the quilt on top and take time to make sure everything is laying flat and smoothly. Now take safety pins and connect the 3 layers together all over the quilt. Now your quilt is in a good spot to do the top stitching. I chose to do this by hand, which is such a nice activity to do at the end of the day while winding down for bedtime with a warm drink. Using a needle and shishiko thread, weave in and out through the layers of fabric to quilt them together. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this is definitely not perfect when I did it, but I think the handmade look obviously goes along with the quilt itself. Alternatively, you could do this on a machine or take it to a local quilter to have the stitching done. Once I was finished hand quilting, it was time for the binding. I'll share a great binding source below for you. I used this Robert Kaufman quilting app to calculate how many strips of fabric I needed to cut for the binding. You just insert the size of quilt, width of your binding strips, and the width of the fabric. I chose to cut 2.5-inch wide strips and connect them together at the end where they are perpendicular. Then sew at an angle to connect them in a way that won't add extra bulk to the quilt. Cut the excess and then fold the binding in half and iron. Cut another angle at the ends of the binding and fold towards the wrong side about 1/4 inch. Starting one side of the back of the quilt, sew one layer of the binding a few inches along the edge. Stop sewing and then reposition the needle to begin sewing about an inch down from the binding. Sew the binding around the quilt at 1/4 of an inch. A 1/4 of an inch before you get to the corners, pivot and sew towards the edge. Fold the binding back and then along the edge to make a clean corner. Continue sewing the binding to the blanket, repeating this process when you get to the corners. When you reach the beginning of the binding, measure where the fabric meets the original stitches. Cut this at an angle and insert into the binding. Press everything well and sew these binding pieces together. Now iron the binding all the way around and especially at the corners. Now sew right along the edge of the binding to finish off the quilt. Make sure you pivot and fold the binding at the edges. Next time I would definitely hand quilt the binding. That is a look that I personally love and I've done it on other quilts. So if you don't want to bind the quilt on a machine, you can definitely do this by hand and I think it will turn out wonderfully. I hope you enjoy creating this project for yourself, for your family, for it to be passed down throughout the years, and as you wash it and wear it and use it, it will keep adding to the story that it already holds. If you're looking for more blanket and quilt ideas, then click this next video.